The morning sun shone softly over the airport, spreading a golden light across the glass windows and polished floors. The terminal buzzed with people, some in a hurry, some half asleep with coffee cups, others excitedly chatting about vacations. Among them stood a tall black man, quietly waiting near the boarding gate. He wore simple jeans and a clean white shirt, holding a small carry-on bag. His face was calm, eyes thoughtful, as if he had too many things on his mind but didn't want to show it. He looked around at the crowd, then checked his phone. The screen showed his boarding pass, first class seat 3A. He had flown many times before, but something about today felt heavier. Maybe it was the long week of meetings ahead, or maybe just the quiet loneliness that came from traveling alone. When the boarding announcement came through the speakers, people began lining up quickly. Families tried to keep their kids close. Business travelers opened their laptops to send last-minute emails, and flight attendants smiled politely as they scanned tickets. The man waited patiently until his group was called. "First-class passengers, you may board now," the attendant said with a friendly smile. He stepped forward, handed her his phone, and she nodded. "Thank you, sir. Enjoy your flight." He gave a small nod and walked down the jet bridge, the sound of his footsteps echoing softly. The cool air from the aircraft brushed against his face as he stepped inside. The cabin smelled faintly of coffee and fresh fabric. In first class, wide leather seats waited, each with a pillow and blanket neatly folded. He placed his bag in the overhead bin, sat down, and took a deep breath. Finally, a moment of peace. He reached into his pocket for his headphones, ready to listen to some quiet music, but before he could put them on, he heard a sharp voice from the aisle. "Excuse me," a woman said, her tone already carrying irritation. "I think you're in the wrong seat." He looked up, surprised. A woman stood beside him, maybe in her 50s, with perfectly curled blonde hair and a pearl necklace that matched her cream-colored sweater. She clutched her designer handbag close, her expression sharp and disapproving. "I'm sorry?" he asked, confused but polite. "This is first class," she said slowly, as if explaining something obvious. "You might want to check your ticket." The man blinked, unsure what to say for a moment. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone again. "This is seat 3A, he said gently, showing her the boarding pass. Her eyes flickered over the screen, then narrowed again. "There must be some mistake. They probably printed the wrong seat number," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "You should ask one of the attendants to help you find where you actually belong." The man sat still, his calm expression not changing much. "I'm sure this is correct," he said softly. "I fly this route often." The woman frowned deeply. "Well, I've been flying with this airline for 20 years and I've never seen—" She stopped herself, her eyes darting toward him, her words hanging in the air. "Someone like you in first class." Her tone was quiet but sharp enough for the people nearby to hear. A young couple sitting across the aisle exchanged uncomfortable glances. The man sitting behind them lowered his newspaper slightly, listening. The black man didn't respond immediately. He looked at her not with anger but with a tired kind of patience. The kind of patience that comes from having lived through similar moments before. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "I'm in the right seat." The woman turned to the flight attendant who was helping another passenger nearby. "Excuse me," she called loudly. "There seems to be a problem here." The attendant, a young woman with a polite smile, hurried over. "What seems to be the issue?" The woman gestured at the man. "This gentleman is sitting in the wrong seat." "I think there's been some mix-up." The attendant turned to the man. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass, please?" He handed her his phone without hesitation. She scanned the QR code and nodded immediately. "Seat 3A, that's correct." The woman's mouth fell open slightly. "That can't be right," she muttered. She stopped again, realizing more people were watching now. "Well, are you sure? Maybe he was upgraded by mistake." The attendant kept her professional tone steady. "No, ma'am. Everything looks fine. He is exactly where he's supposed to be." The man smiled slightly, still calm. "Thank you," he said quietly. The woman huffed, clearly embarrassed but unwilling to back down. "Well, I suppose standards have changed," she said under her breath as she sat down in the seat beside him. 3B. He didn't respond. He just put his headphones back in and looked out the window. The engines were starting up, the soft rumble filling the cabin. But even with the noise, the tension between them hung heavy in the air. The passengers nearby were quiet. Some pretended not to notice. Others shook their heads slightly, disapproving but unwilling to get involved. The flight attendant returned a few minutes later with a glass of water for each of them. "Would either of you like something before takeoff?" she asked, trying to ease the mood. The woman took her glass without looking up. The man smiled and said, "Just water is fine, thank you." As the plane began to move, the man leaned his head back. He didn't want to think about what had just happened. He had learned long ago that sometimes silence was the best answer, but it still stung. Not the words exactly, but the look. The look that said, "You don't belong here." The look that followed him in boardrooms, in restaurants, and now even here, 30,000 feet above the ground. He tried to focus on his breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Let it go, he told himself. You've got bigger things to think about. Important meetings, new projects, real challenges that matter. But a few minutes later, the woman's voice cut through his thoughts again. "So what do you do?" she asked suddenly, her tone cold. "You must work for the airline or something?" He turned toward her, surprised she was still talking to him. "No," he said slowly. "I don't work for the airline." She nodded stiffly. "Ah, so maybe you're a performer or something? A musician? They sometimes give upgrades for those people." He smiled faintly. "No, not that either." Her curiosity turned sharper. "Well then, how exactly did you afford a first-class ticket?" she asked, her voice dropping just enough to sound like she was trying to sound polite. But the judgment was clear. The man took a sip of his water before answering. "The same way you did, I suppose." "I bought it." Her mouth twitched. She looked away, pretending to read a magazine. The conversation ended, but the uncomfortable air remained. The plane took off smoothly, the city disappearing below the clouds. The man kept quiet, focusing on the gentle hum of the engines. He remembered the first time he ever flew in first class. It had been years ago, back when he was just starting his career. He'd saved up for months, promising himself that one day he'd sit at the front of the plane, not as a guest, not as a favor, but because he earned it. And he had. Through years of hard work, late nights, and endless persistence, he didn't need anyone's approval. Yet moments like this always reminded him that success didn't always protect you from prejudice. After an hour or so, the attendants began serving meals. The man lowered his tray and thanked the attendant as she placed his plate in front of him. The woman beside him looked over and said, "You must travel a lot." "Yes," he replied. "Quite a bit." She hesitated, then added, "Well, I suppose it must be interesting, traveling so much." "You meet all kinds of people," he nodded. "That's true." There was a long pause before she said, "You're very calm, you know. I didn't mean to offend you earlier." He looked at her, then gave a small nod. "I know. I just thought maybe there was a mistake," she said, trying to sound casual. He didn't answer, only gave a polite smile. Inside, he wanted to tell her that this wasn't new, that people often assumed he didn't belong, that people often saw his skin before they saw his story. But he didn't say it. He'd learned that not every battle was worth fighting. Instead, he finished his meal quietly and pulled out a notebook from his bag. He began jotting down ideas for the upcoming meeting he was traveling to attend. The woman glanced at the notebook. "Are you in business?" she asked suddenly. "Yes," he said simply. "What kind of business?" she pressed. He hesitated for a moment, then said, "Technology." "Oh," she said, sounding mildly impressed. "You must be one of those tech guys. Computers and all that," he smiled again. "Something like that." She nodded, pretending to understand, then went back to flipping through her magazine. The rest of the flight passed in relative silence. Every now and then, she would glance at him, perhaps wondering more about who he really was. There was something about his quiet confidence that didn't quite fit the assumptions she had made earlier. At one point, a flight attendant walked by and said cheerfully, "Mr. B, if you need anything at all, just let us know." The woman looked up. "They seem to know you," she said carefully. He gave a small shrug. "I travel often," he said again. "Oh," she murmured. Her tone was softer this time, less sharp, more uncertain. As the hours passed, the cabin lights dimmed and most passengers settled into their seats for rest. The man closed his eyes and leaned back, finally able to relax. The woman beside him shifted uncomfortably, replaying the earlier scene in her mind. The glances from other passengers, the way she had sounded, the quiet dignity of the man sitting next to her. For the first time, she felt something she rarely did. Guilt. She looked at him again, sleeping peacefully, and wondered who he really was. He didn't look angry. He didn't look resentful. Just peaceful. Maybe even kind. It made her uncomfortable, not because he had done anything wrong, but because she had. The flight attendants moved quietly down the aisle, pretending not to notice the tension in the air. But everyone around could feel it. Some people turned their heads, pretending to look out the window, while others stared straight ahead, pretending to read magazines. Still, the silence said everything. The man sat calmly, his hands folded on his lap. He didn't say a word. There was no anger on his face, no hint of frustration. Only calmness, the kind that made others unsure what he was thinking. The woman beside him, on the other hand, kept shifting in her seat, her face tight with irritation. She couldn't understand how he could sit there so quietly, as if nothing had happened. She tapped her fingers on the armrest, her eyes darting to the flight attendant who had walked away after confirming that he did indeed belong there. The plane's engines began to hum softly, signaling the final preparations before takeoff. The woman sighed, crossed her arms, and muttered under her breath, "Unbelievable." The man turned slightly, looking at her, and said in a calm, polite tone, "If it makes you uncomfortable, I can ask to switch seats." His voice was gentle, not defensive, not sarcastic. Just calm. She looked at him sharply. "You don't have to. I'll survive." He nodded once, then looked away. There was no anger, no smugness, nothing. Just quiet dignity. A few rows back, a young couple exchanged glances. The woman whispered to her partner, "That's awful. Did you hear what she said earlier?" Her partner nodded. "Yeah, some people just can't help themselves." As the plane began to roll forward, the captain's voice came through the speakers, warm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to take off. Please fasten your seatbelts and make sure your tray tables are up." The woman pressed her head back against the seat, trying to focus on something else. She glanced out the window, watching the airport buildings roll past. The man beside her quietly adjusted his seatbelt, then closed his eyes as if to rest. The moment the plane lifted off the ground, there was a soft gasp from the passengers. Some people clutched their armrests. Others smiled. The woman stared out the window again, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. For a brief moment she saw herself, and she didn't like what she saw. She tried to push the thought away. After the seatbelt sign turned off, flight attendants moved down the aisle offering drinks. The man asked for water. The woman asked for wine. As the attendant handed her the glass, she said, "Rough start?" The woman forced a small smile. "Something like that." The attendant nodded politely and moved on. The woman took a sip of her drink, trying to relax, but the quiet beside her made her uneasy. The man didn't say a word. He was reading something on a tablet now, completely unbothered. She wanted to ignore him, but the silence between them felt heavy. Finally, after several minutes, she said, "So what do you do?" He looked up from his tablet, surprised but polite. "Work," he said simply. She frowned. "Well, yes, obviously. I mean, what kind of work?" He smiled slightly. "I travel a lot. Meet people. Try to solve problems where I can." That was all he said. No details, no titles. The woman waited for more, but he went back to reading. She sighed loudly, hoping to draw a reaction. But he didn't look up. She muttered to herself, "Must be nice having that kind of free time." He turned slightly and said, "I suppose we all make time for what matters." His tone was calm again, too calm. It made her feel small without him even trying. She didn't respond. A few rows away, a flight attendant accidentally dropped a small tray. The man stood immediately, helping her pick it up before anyone else moved. He smiled, saying, "Don't worry about it, happens to everyone." The flight attendant smiled gratefully. "Thank you, sir." The woman watched this quietly. She didn't know why, but something about how naturally he helped made her uncomfortable. Not because it was wrong, but because it made her realize how she had behaved earlier. After a while, lunch was served. The woman ordered the chicken. The man ordered the vegetarian option. She noticed he spoke politely to everyone. The attendants, the passengers, even a small boy who had been crying a few seats away. He had that kind of kindness that didn't need to be loud. When the child dropped his toy car under the seats, the man leaned down, found it, and handed it back with a gentle smile. The little boy's mother thanked him repeatedly. The woman stared straight ahead, pretending not to notice, but she did notice. Every little thing. Time passed slowly. The sky outside was clear, endless blue. The plane sailed smoothly above the clouds. Some passengers slept, others watched movies. The woman tried to distract herself, but her thoughts kept circling back to what she'd said earlier. She had always thought of herself as a decent person. She donated to charities sometimes, she volunteered once a year, she treated people fairly and or so she believed. But something about this moment felt different. Why had she reacted that way? Why had she felt so uncomfortable sitting beside him? The questions gnawed at her even as she tried to shake them off. She glanced at him again. He was still reading, completely at peace. There was no anger, no grudge, no coldness. Just calm. Are you always this quiet? She asked suddenly. He looked up, surprised by her tone. Usually, he said with a small smile. Silence says a lot if you listen to it. She laughed lightly, though it wasn't really a laugh. That's an odd way to put it, he shrugged.
Maybe, but sometimes people talk too much to avoid hearing themselves think. That made her pause. He went back to reading.
And she stared at the seat in front of her, thinking about his words. The rest of the flight went on quietly for a while. Occasionally, the woman would make small comments about the turbulence or the meal, and he would respond politely. But there was still a distance, not from him, but from her own guilt. She noticed that even the flight attendants spoke to him with quiet respect. They seemed to know him somehow, though she didn't pay attention to that detail at first. As the plane began to approach cruising altitude, the captain announced they'd soon have a brief delay due to air traffic. People groaned softly. The woman rolled her eyes. Of course, she muttered. Just my luck, he smiled faintly. Sometimes delays keep us safe. She gave a small snort. You sound like one of those people who find meaning in everything. He looked at her calmly. I try to. She turned away again. But deep down, something about that answer made her uncomfortable. Not because it was annoying, but because it was true. After a while, the woman decided to get up and stretch. She walked to the restroom, glancing at herself in the mirror afterward. She didn't like what she saw, not her face, but her expression. For the first time, she really saw the irritation and pride that had been written all over her earlier. When she returned to her seat, the man stood to let her pass, polite as always. Thank you, she said quietly. You're welcome, he replied, his tone as warm as ever. It surprised her, how someone she had insulted could still treat her with such grace. As she sat back down, a thought crossed her mind. Maybe she had been wrong about him, but she pushed the thought away quickly. She didn't like being wrong. The hours went by slowly. The plane floated through golden clouds as the sun began to set. The cabin lights dimmed, and a soft orange glow filled the windows. Most passengers were asleep or lost in their own worlds. The woman leaned back, closing her eyes. She couldn't sleep. Her mind kept replaying the moment she had spoken out, the way people had stared, the quiet disappointment on the flight attendant's face. She wanted to forget it, to pretend it didn't matter. But she couldn't. The man's calmness made it worse somehow. He hadn't argued, hadn't shouted, hadn't even defended himself. That silence felt heavier than any words could have. Eventually she whispered, Why didn't you say anything back there? He turned slightly. Would it have helped? I don't know. Maybe. He thought for a moment. Sometimes silence teaches better than anger ever could. She nodded slowly, looking down at her hands. I guess I should apologize, she said quietly, almost too low for him to hear. He looked at her, not with judgment but with kindness. You don't have to, he said gently. We all have moments we're not proud of. She swallowed hard, unsure what to say next. For the first time, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Respect not for his title, not for his looks, but for his grace. The rest of the flight passed in thoughtful silence. The woman didn't speak again. She just sat quietly, watching the stars appear one by one outside the window. Somewhere over the ocean, as the world below turned to darkness, she realized something simple but powerful. That respect isn't something others earn by proving themselves. It's something you give because they're human, just like you. She didn't say it out loud, but deep inside she knew this flight would stay with her forever. And what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that the quiet man sitting beside her was far more than she could ever have imagined, because in just a few hours when the plane landed, The world she thought she understood was going to shift completely. The flight had been smooth for most of the journey, but as they started to descend, the air inside the cabin seemed different. The quiet hum of the engines mixed with a low tension that everyone could feel but no one dared to mention. The woman beside the man had been unusually quiet for the last hour. Her eyes shifted often toward him, but every time he looked up she turned away, pretending to read or look out the window. She wasn't angry anymore. That much was clear. Now she looked restless, like someone realizing too late that their own words had betrayed them. The man, on the other hand, sat calmly. He had taken off his headphones and was reading something on his tablet, his face steady and focused. The world around him seemed not to affect him, but deep inside he could still feel the weight of that earlier moment. He had learned to carry such moments quietly, without bitterness. As the plane began its final descent, the captain's voice came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be landing in Los Angeles shortly. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened." The man put his tablet away and straightened his seat. The woman did the same, keeping her eyes fixed on the view outside. The city light sparkled below, stretching endlessly like a blanket of stars. A few minutes later, the plane touched down smoothly. A ripple of relief ran through the passengers as the brakes hissed and the engines slowed. People began reaching for their phones, eager to text or call their loved ones. The woman finally turned to the man. Her voice was hesitant. "You travel for work, right?" He nodded. "Yes," she swallowed. "I think I might have seen you before. Maybe on the news or something." He smiled faintly. "That's possible." Before she could ask more, the intercom crackled again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special acknowledgement today. On behalf of our airline, we'd like to thank one of our distinguished passengers for being part of our journey, someone who has played a big role in making our planes safer and more efficient." The woman blinked in surprise, looking around. The passengers began whispering. Who could it be? The captain continued, "We're honored to have Mr. B on board today. He's the founder of one of the leading technology firms that helped us develop the navigation systems used in this very aircraft. Please join us in welcoming him." There was a pause, and then quiet applause spread through the cabin. The woman froze. She slowly turned toward the man sitting beside her, the same man she had complained about at the beginning of the flight. He smiled politely, nodding to a few passengers who clapped nearby. The woman's face turned pale. Her hands trembled slightly as she whispered, "That's you?" He nodded. "That's me." She stared at him, speechless. The memory of her earlier words hit her like a wave. She remembered every glance, every assumption she had made, every unkind thing she had said. The applause faded, but her embarrassment didn't. She looked down at her hands, her voice breaking a little. I didn't know." He took a slow breath. "You didn't have to. I feel awful," she said softly. "I shouldn't have spoken to you that way." He nodded, his tone gentle. "It's all right. You didn't know who I was. But maybe it shouldn't take a title to treat someone with respect." Her eyes filled with tears. "You're right." "You're absolutely right." The flight attendants smiled at him as they passed by, thanking him quietly. The passengers nearby looked at him differently now, some with admiration, others with quiet shame for having stayed silent earlier. The woman could hardly meet his eyes. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I was so wrong about you." He gave a kind smile. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after." She nodded, holding back tears. "I'm sorry, truly." He simply said, "Apology accepted." When the plane reached the gate, passengers stood up, pulling their bags from the overhead bins. The man waited patiently for the aisle to clear before standing. The woman stood beside him, still shaken by her own behavior. As they walked out together, the pilot was waiting near the door, greeting passengers as they exited. When he saw the man, his face lit up. "It's good to see you again, sir," he said warmly. "Thank you again for everything you've done for our team." The woman's eyes widened. The pilot knew him personally. The man smiled and shook the pilot's hand. "Always a pleasure." "Safe flying," the pilot chuckled. "Thanks to you, we always are." The woman walked silently behind him, feeling smaller with every step. The crowd outside the plane moved quickly toward baggage claim, but she lingered, not ready to leave yet. She finally gathered the courage to speak again. "You must think I'm a terrible person." He looked at her, his expression calm. No, I think you're human. And humans sometimes let their fears speak before their hearts do. She wiped her eyes quietly. That's generous of you, he smiled softly. It's just experience. I've met many people like you. People who just never had to question their own assumptions before. She hesitated. Can I ask you something? Of course, he said. When the pilot announced your name, you didn't even look proud or surprised. Why? He chuckled quietly. Because respect built on recognition isn't real respect. I've seen people's attitudes change the moment they find out who I am. But I don't want to be treated well because of a title. I want to be treated well because I'm a person. Her eyes filled again. You deserve that. Everyone does, he nodded. That's true. They walked together down the jet bridge. The busy noise of the airport filled the air, the sound of rolling suitcases, airport announcements, children laughing in the distance. At the gate, he turned toward her. Take care of yourself, he said gently. She looked at him one last time, her voice soft. Thank you. For being kind when I didn't deserve it. He gave a faint smile. Kindness isn't something people earn. It's something we choose, and then he walked away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving her standing there, watching. For a moment she stayed still, feeling the strange quiet that comes when guilt turns into reflection. She thought about how quickly she had judged him based on nothing but appearances. She had assumed things about him before he had even spoken a word. Now she realized how wrong she had been. As she walked through the terminal, she couldn't stop thinking about his words. Respect built on recognition isn't real respect. It echoed in her mind like a lesson she would never forget. She found a seat near the exit and sat down for a moment, her hands clasped together. Around her, people moved fast, rushing to catch flights, greet loved ones, or buy coffee. Everyone was living their own story, and she, for the first time in a long while, was questioning hers. She wondered how many people she had treated unfairly in small ways. The waiter she once ignored, the store clerk she snapped at, the taxi driver she assumed didn't understand English. They were all moments that had seemed small then but felt heavy now. She sighed deeply. The truth was, she had lived most of her life inside a small circle of comfort, never questioning how her own assumptions shaped the world she saw. But now one stranger, quiet, patient, and kind, had changed that. Outside the airport, the air was warm. The sunset painted the sky with colors that looked almost unreal. She walked slowly to the taxi stand, her thoughts still swirling. A car pulled up, and as she got inside, the driver smiled at her. For the first time, she smiled back genuinely. How's your day going? She asked. The driver, surprised, chuckled softly. It's been good, ma'am. Thanks for asking, she nodded. That's good to hear. It was a small thing. A simple exchange. But it felt different. Real. Meanwhile, in another part of the airport, the man was walking through a side corridor toward a waiting car. His assistant was already there, holding a tablet and a folder. Your meeting at the tech summit has been moved up to tomorrow morning, the assistant said. All right, he replied calmly. As they walked, the assistant said, You seem thoughtful today. He smiled faintly. Just thinking about how quick people are to judge, but also how fast they can change when given a chance. The assistant nodded. That woman on the plane? He nodded. Yes. She reminded me that sometimes the biggest lessons happen in the smallest moments. They reached the car, and as he got in, he glanced out at the sky. The last light of the sun was fading, and the city was beginning to glow. He thought about all the faces he had seen, those who smiled, those who doubted, those who apologized. It was all part of the same story. He didn't hold anger toward them, just a quiet hope that one day the world would stop needing reminders like this, that one day people would simply see each other as people. The car pulled away from the airport, blending into the steady flow of traffic. Back inside the terminal, the woman stood outside the coffee shop waiting for her drink. When the barista handed it to her, she said softly, Thank you. The barista smiled. You're welcome. Have a great day, she nodded. You too. It was such a simple thing to say, but now it meant more than it ever had. Days passed after that flight, but the moment kept replaying in her mind like a film she couldn't turn off. The look on his face when she had questioned him, the calm in his eyes when he forgave her, the applause that followed his name being announced, every piece of it stayed with her. She couldn't explain why it affected her so much. Maybe because it wasn't just embarrassment. It was deeper. It was the realization that she had become someone she never thought she was. Someone who judged before knowing. Who spoke without thinking. Back in her home, she sat in her kitchen one morning with a cup of tea in her hands. The house was quiet, sunlight spilling through the curtains. It was peaceful, but inside her head there was noise, thoughts, questions, regrets. She looked at her phone, tempted to search his name. But something stopped her. She didn't want to know more about him because of who he was in the world. She already knew the part that mattered. The kind, patient person who had taught her something without even trying. For the first time in years, she started to look at people differently. When she went to the grocery store, she made an effort to smile at the cashier instead of hurrying past. When a delivery driver dropped off a package, she thanked him sincerely. When she passed her neighbors on the street, she greeted them with warmth she hadn't shown before. It wasn't just about being polite. It was about being aware, about remembering that everyone she met was living a story she didn't know. One afternoon, she sat in a cafe near her office watching people walk by outside. There was a young couple laughing together, a man in work clothes eating a sandwich on a bench, a mother pushing a stroller. She realized that for most of her life, she had moved through the world without really seeing anyone. A memory flashed in her mind. The man on the plane sitting quietly as she complained to the flight attendant. The way he never raised his voice, never tried to humiliate her back, even though she had tried to humiliate him. That image stayed with her. She whispered to herself, "He didn't need to teach me a lesson." But he did. From that day, she decided she wanted to do something with that realization. She didn't know what yet, but she wanted to be better. Meanwhile, the man from the plane had returned to his busy schedule. Meetings, interviews, late nights. He was used to the rhythm of success, the pressure, the expectations, the endless travel. But every now and then, he thought about that flight too. He didn't remember her face with anger. Instead, he remembered her silence at the end, her eyes filled with regret. He had met people who never changed, but he sensed she might. And that thought gave him hope. One evening, as he prepared a presentation for a charity event, he decided to include a small story, not naming anyone, not pointing fingers, just a story about kindness and perception. He wrote, "Sometimes the greatest lesson you can give someone isn't through argument or proof. It's through patience and grace." That line stayed in his speech. When he delivered it at a business conference a week later, it caught people's attention, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. He told the audience, "Success isn't measured by money or titles. It's measured by how you treat people when you have nothing to gain from them." The audience gave him a standing ovation. Cameras flashed, journalists wrote about it, and social media began to quote him. But to him, it wasn't about attention. It was about truth. Back in her city, the woman was scrolling through her phone one evening when a headline caught her eye. "CEO shares powerful message about kindness after unexpected flight experience." She froze. Her heart beat faster. She tapped the article and saw his picture. It was him. The same calm face, the same eyes. She read the entire story. How he had spoken about judgment, about patience, about respect. She felt tears forming again, but this time they weren't just from guilt. They were from gratitude. Gratitude that he had turned something painful into something good. The next morning, she decided to write him a letter. Not an email, not a message, and a handwritten letter. Something that came from the heart. She sat at her desk, took out a piece of paper, and began to write. "Dear sir, you may not remember me, but I will never forget you. We met on a flight not long ago. I was the woman who made assumptions before I even knew your name. I was rude and I was wrong. I've thought about that day every single day since. I've changed because of it. Not because you shamed me, but because you didn't. You showed me what real dignity looks like. You could have made me feel small, but instead you chose kindness. I just wanted to say thank you for that." With respect, a woman who learned a lesson the hard way. She read the letter twice before sealing it in an envelope. She didn't expect a reply. She just needed to send it. She found the address of his company online and mailed it that same day. Weeks passed. Life went on. She almost forgot about the letter until one morning when she checked her mailbox and saw an envelope addressed to her in clean, neat handwriting. Her heart raced as she opened it. "Dear Madam, thank you for your letter. I do remember that flight. I also remember your courage to apologize. Most people wouldn't have done that. It takes strength to admit when we're wrong. If my calmness that day made a difference, then I'm grateful. But please remember, and it wasn't about me. It was about reminding both of us that respect is not earned by position, but given by choice. I wish you all the best on your journey forward. Warm regards, B. She read the note again and again, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't forgiveness she needed. It was the reminder that she could still grow, still become better than she was. Over time, she began volunteering at a local community center. At first, she just helped serve food at weekend events. Then she started joining discussions, listening to people's stories. Immigrants, workers, parents, students. Each story reminded her of the lesson she had learned on that flight. She realized how easy it was to misunderstand someone when you only saw them from the outside. Everyone she met had something she couldn't see at first glance. A struggle, a dream, a history. One evening, as she was cleaning up after a charity dinner, one of the younger volunteers asked, "Why do you come here every week?" "You don't have to," she smiled. "Because someone once showed me what kindness looks like. I'm just trying to pass it on." The young volunteer grinned. "That's a good reason," she laughed softly. "It's the best reason I've ever had." Meanwhile, across the country, the man continued his work quietly. His company grew, his projects expanded, and his message of empathy reached more people. But he never forgot that flight either. It reminded him that change doesn't always come from power or influence. Sometimes it comes from a small moment between two strangers. 1 year later, he was invited to speak at another event, this time about leadership and humility. As he stood on the stage, he looked at the crowd and began his story. "Once I met someone who judged me before knowing me," he said gently. "But that experience taught me something. That kindness is not a weakness. It's a strength. It's what allows us to change hearts without shouting." The audience listened quietly. He didn't mention names or places, just the message. And by the end, people stood and clapped again, not for his success, but for the truth he spoke. After the talk, as he walked toward the exit, a woman approached him. She was middle-aged, holding a small notebook in her hands. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Your words, they reminded me of something I once went through. I just wanted to say thank you." He smiled kindly. "Thank you for listening." As she walked away, he thought again of the woman on the plane. Maybe she was somewhere in the crowd. Maybe she wasn't. But her story, their story, had become bigger than both of them. Back in her own life, she had found peace. She no longer carried the guilt from that flight, only the lesson. Every time she traveled, she smiled at the person next to her, no matter who they were or where they came from. Once, while on a short flight for work, she found herself sitting next to a nervous young man who was flying for the first time. He looked anxious, clutching the armrest tightly. She leaned over and said kindly, "Don't worry, it's going to be fine. The first flight is always the hardest." He smiled weakly. "I'm just scared of flying," she nodded. "I used to be scared too, not of flying, but of people. I used to think I knew who they were before I even spoke to them. But I was wrong. You'd be surprised how much you can learn when you just listen." The young man nodded slowly, relaxing a little. "Thanks, that helps," she smiled. "Anytime." When the plane landed, he thanked her again for her kindness. And as she walked through the terminal, she thought about how life had come full circle. Once she had been the one learning a lesson on a plane. Now she was passing that same kindness forward. She didn't need recognition. She didn't need anyone to know her story. What mattered was that she had changed, and that she kept choosing to be better every day. Time has a quiet way of moving forward. It doesn't shout, it doesn't rush, it simply carries moments with it, folding them into the past while leaving their echoes behind. For both of them, the man and the woman, that flight had become one of those echoes. It lived quietly inside them, shaping how they saw the world, how they spoke, and how they treated people. Months turned into a year, and life, as always, went on. The man continued his work, traveling to new places, meeting new faces, giving talks about leadership and humility. His success grew, but he stayed the same calm, grounded person. He had seen enough in life to know that real strength wasn't about power or wealth. It was about staying kind in a world that often wasn't. He didn't think much about that woman anymore, but every now and then, when he saw a passenger on a plane looking uncomfortable beside someone different from them, he remembered. He remembered that quiet moment when forgiveness had felt stronger than pride. The woman's life had changed too, but in softer ways. She wasn't famous or important like him, but she carried the lesson she'd learned like a quiet light inside her. She spoke differently now, slower, kinder. She listened more than she talked. And though no one else knew about it, she had made a promise to herself. Never again would she look at someone and decide their worth before knowing their story. One day, she was at the community center where she now volunteered regularly. The place was alive with laughter and the clatter of dishes as volunteers served food to families. She stood at one of the tables pouring juice for children when a coworker walked up to her. "Did you hear about that conference next week?" the coworker asked. "They're inviting a guest speaker from one of those big tech companies. Apparently he's incredible, does a lot of charity work too." The woman smiled faintly, her heart giving a small jump. "Oh, what's his name?" Her coworker read from a flyer. The woman froze. The air seemed to shift around her. She looked down at the flyer and saw his picture. The same face she had seen on that flight, the same calm expression. "He's coming here?" she asked quietly. "Yeah," her coworker said. "They're hosting him at the city auditorium. You should come. He's really inspiring." The woman nodded slowly, her thoughts spinning. She hadn't seen him since that day. She had written, and he had replied, but that was the last time they had communicated. A small part of her had always hoped she might meet him again, just to thank him one more time. Not for forgiving her, but for changing her. The following week came quickly. The auditorium buzzed with energy as people filled the seats. Business leaders, students, community members, everyone was eager to hear him speak. The woman found a seat near the back, her heart beating faster than she expected. When he walked on stage, the crowd broke into applause. He wore a simple suit, his posture calm and confident. He smiled as he began to speak, his voice gentle yet strong. He talked about success, about humanity, about the importance of seeing people beyond their appearance or status. And then, just as she had hoped, he shared the story. Their story, once again. "I once sat on a flight beside someone who judged me before knowing me," he said softly. "At the time, I could have responded with anger, but I didn't, because I've learned that people often act out of ignorance, not evil, and the only way to change ignorance is through kindness." The room was silent. Every word felt heavy, real, true. He continued, "That day taught me that respect should never depend on titles or wealth. It should come from the simple fact that we're all human. We all deserve dignity." The woman felt her eyes sting with tears. It was surreal. Hearing her own mistake turned into a lesson that now inspired hundreds of people. She wiped her eyes quietly, hoping no one noticed. When his speech ended, the crowd stood and clapped loudly. He thanked them humbly, then stepped off the stage to greet a few organizers. The woman sat frozen for a moment, unsure if she should go to him or just leave quietly. But something inside her, that same courage that made her write him that letter, pushed her to stand up. She walked slowly toward the front, weaving through the crowd, her palms slightly trembling. When she finally reached him, he was talking with a few people. She waited patiently until he turned and saw her. For a second, his expression was unreadable, then a warm smile spread across his face. "I was wondering if I'd ever see you again," he said softly. She smiled back, her voice shaky. "I wasn't sure if you'd remember me." "I do," he said. "Some people you don't forget, especially those who change for the better." Her throat tightened. "You were right that day. Respect shouldn't depend on titles. I didn't really understand that before, but I do now." He nodded, his eyes kind. "You understood it the moment you decided to see differently. That's what matters." She took a deep breath. "I just wanted to thank you again, not for forgiving me, but for showing me what patience looks like. You didn't have to be kind to me, but you were." He smiled gently. "You gave me a chance to practice what I believe in. So, thank you too." They both laughed softly, the kind of laughter that comes from shared understanding rather than humor. A young reporter nearby saw them and approached. "Excuse me," the reporter said. "Would you mind if I took a photo?" You two seem to share an interesting story. The man looked at the woman and she shook her head. I'd rather keep this just between us, she said quietly. He nodded in agreement. Some stories are better lived than told. The reporter smiled and stepped away. The woman looked at him again. You know, after that flight, I changed how I live. I started volunteering, meeting people I never would have spoken to before. I stopped seeing faces as categories. I started seeing them as people. And it's strange, but I feel happier now and I'm freer. He smiled, clearly moved. That's the kind of success that matters. They talked for a few more minutes about life, about change, about how small moments can leave big marks. And when it was time to go, she extended her hand. It was good to see you again. He shook it warmly. It was good to see who you've become. As she turned to leave, she felt lighter than she had in years. She stepped outside the auditorium and looked up at the sky. The sun was setting, painting the clouds with gold. She took a deep breath and smiled. For the first time, she truly understood what it meant to be at peace with herself. Across the street, a group of young people were handing out flyers for a charity event. She walked over, took one, and said, "Do you need any help?" The young woman handing out flyers grinned. "We always need help. I'd like to volunteer," she said with a smile. And just like that, another small circle of kindness began, one that would ripple outward, touching people she'd never even meet. That evening, as she sat by her window at home, she thought back to that first flight, the noise, the tension, the awkward silence, and then the forgiveness. How a few hours in the air had changed the entire course of her life. She whispered softly to herself, "Thank you," not to anyone in particular, but to the universe for giving her that lesson. Meanwhile, the man returned to his hotel after the event. He sat down, took off his jacket, and looked out at the city lights. His assistant had left a pile of notes on the desk, reports, plans, schedules, but he didn't open them. Instead, he sat quietly, thinking about that woman again. He smiled, not because of the past, but because of what it had become. A story of transformation. A reminder that even one uncomfortable encounter can create something good if handled with grace. He pulled out his notebook and wrote a single line at the top of a fresh page. One act of kindness can rewrite someone's story, even your own. He closed the notebook and leaned back in his chair, feeling a quiet satisfaction that no amount of success could replace. The next morning, he received an email from one of the event organizers. It included a message from a young student who had attended the talk. The message read, "Your words made me realize how unfair I've been to people around me. I'm going to start treating everyone the same way I want to be treated. Thank you for opening my eyes." He smiled as he read it. The chain of kindness was growing. It had started from pain, turned into reflection, and now it was inspiring others. That night, the woman and the man, in their separate homes, looked out their windows at the same sky, not knowing that they were both thinking the same thought. That maybe, just maybe, the world could change one heart at a time. The story of that flight had never made the news. No one filmed it, no one tweeted about it, but it didn't need to. It lived where stories matter most, in people's hearts, because kindness doesn't always make noise. Sometimes it just quietly changes the air around you until everything feels a little lighter. And that's how two strangers, one who had spoken too soon, and one who had chosen patience instead of pride, taught each other the most important lesson of all, that dignity isn't something you earn, and respect isn't something you demand. They are gifts we give freely, simply because we're human. And from that day on, both of them carried that truth, not as a burden, but as a quiet light that guided them through every new face, every new day, every new chance to do better. A few years had passed since that unforgettable flight. The world had changed in small ways, just as people do. Seasons came and went, cities grew taller, and new faces appeared in the places where old ones used to be. Yet some stories didn't fade with time. They stayed alive in people's hearts, carried quietly like soft lanterns that lit the way when life felt dark. The story of that day on the plane had become one of those quiet lanterns. Not because it was told on television or written in the news, but because it lived through actions, the little things people did differently after being touched by it. The man, now more respected than ever, had turned his attention from business to people. He had started a small foundation that focused on building opportunities for underprivileged youth. He often told his team, Knowledge can build machines, but compassion builds humans. His foundation was growing fast, spreading to different countries, run not by investors, but by everyday people who believed in kindness as power. One afternoon, he visited a local school that his foundation had helped renovate. The school was small, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood filled with children whose laughter echoed through the hallways. The principal welcomed him warmly, introducing him to a group of students who had prepared drawings to show their appreciation. One young boy stood shyly in the corner, holding his paper close to his chest. The man knelt down and asked softly, "Can I see your drawing?" The boy hesitated, then slowly held it out. The picture showed two people sitting on a plane, one angry, one calm, and above them were the words, "Be kind even when it's hard." The man smiled deeply. "That's beautiful," he said. "Did you come up with that yourself?" The boy nodded. "My mom told me a story like that once," he said. "She said someone on a plane taught her to see people differently. I think it's about you." The man froze for a moment, his eyes softening. "Your mom?" he asked gently. The boy nodded again, smiling proudly. "Yeah, she volunteers at the community center. She said you forgave her." The man felt his heart swell, not with pride, but with something much gentler. He looked around and saw her standing by the doorway, watching quietly with her hands clasped together. Her hair had more silver in it now, but her eyes carried the same humility he remembered. They hadn't spoken in years, but seeing her there, smiling at the children, helping them learn, he realized she had become a completely different person, not just in how she acted, but in how she lived. After the class ended, she walked over slowly. "I didn't think we'd cross paths again," she said softly. He smiled warmly. "Neither did I, but I'm glad we did." They talked for a while, walking through the school's small garden. She told him about her work with children, about how volunteering had changed her life, and how she had found peace in helping others. "I used to think that forgiveness was a favor one person gives another," she said quietly, "but now I know it's a gift you give yourself too." He nodded thoughtfully. "That's true. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it frees you from being trapped in it." They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the wind move through the trees. The sound was soft, almost like a whisper from the past, reminding them how far they'd both come. Before leaving, the man looked back at the children playing and said, "You know, I think that flight wasn't an accident. Maybe we were meant to meet, not for what happened that day, but for what it helped us both become." She smiled. "I think you're right." Later that evening, as he sat by his hotel window, he thought about how life had come full circle. The same woman who once judged him for his appearance was now teaching children about kindness, not with words, but with her actions. It reminded him that change doesn't always happen in a flash. Sometimes it grows slowly, like sunlight creeping across a room, until one day you realize everything looks brighter. The next morning, his foundation hosted an event celebrating volunteers from all around the region. Teachers, doctors, artists, and workers of every background came together to share stories of compassion. It wasn't about awards or fame, it was about connection. He stood on stage and began to speak. "When I started this foundation, I didn't want to build an organization. I wanted to build understanding. We all live different lives, but we share the same sky, the same air, the same hopes. What separates us isn't our color, our job, or where we come from. It's only how we choose to treat each other." He paused, scanning the crowd, and his gaze found her sitting among the volunteers. She smiled back, proud and content. "Years ago," he continued, "I met someone who reminded me that even painful encounters can turn into something beautiful if we let them. That moment changed me. It reminded me that the world doesn't need more walls, it needs more bridges. And those bridges are built from kindness." The room filled with quiet applause, not thunderous but sincere, the kind of applause that comes from hearts that truly understand. After the event, a young journalist approached him. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You talk a lot about forgiveness and respect. What made you believe in those things so deeply?" He thought for a moment, then smiled. "Because I've seen what happens when people are given a chance to change. And I've seen what happens when they aren't. I'd rather live in a world that believes people can do better." The journalist nodded thoughtfully. "That's a message worth sharing." He laughed softly. "It's not mine to share anymore. It belongs to everyone now." Meanwhile, across town, the woman returned to the community center. She gathered a group of young volunteers to plan a neighborhood project, painting murals that celebrated unity and hope. She stood before a blank wall with a paintbrush in her hand and asked, "What should we write here?" A teenage girl replied, "Something simple, something that everyone can understand." After a long pause, the woman smiled and said, "How about this? See people, not labels." The group agreed, and together they painted the words in bright colors across the wall. People passing by stopped to read it, and many smiled. Some even joined in, adding their own handprints beside the message. In the following weeks, the mural became a small landmark. Local newspapers wrote about it, calling it the Wall of Respect. But for the woman, it was more than art. It was a promise. A reminder of where she had been and who she had become. One afternoon, while painting another wall nearby, she received a message from the foundation's office. It was an invitation to a new international conference on empathy and equality, and she had been nominated as one of the speakers. At first, she thought there must be a mistake. But the message was clear. They wanted her to share her story. Not the embarrassing details, but the transformation, the lesson, the hope. Standing backstage weeks later, she took a deep breath. The audience was huge, far bigger than she had ever imagined speaking to. She wasn't used to microphones or spotlights. Her palms were sweating and her heart raced, but when she walked on stage and saw the faces looking back at her, she felt something shift inside. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about the message. She began, her voice calm and clear. "A few years ago, I made a mistake. I judged someone before I knew them. That moment could have ended in anger or hate, but instead, it turned into forgiveness, and that forgiveness became the starting point of my change." The room was silent, every ear listening. I stand here today not as someone perfect, but as someone who learned that it's never too late to see differently, to speak kindly, and to choose understanding over pride. We can't erase what we've done, but we can always write what comes next. When she finished, the crowd gave her a standing ovation. But the real reward wasn't the applause. It was seeing the man standing near the front, smiling proudly, clapping with everyone else. Later, backstage, he approached her once again. "You've come a long way," he said. She smiled softly. "I had a good teacher." He laughed lightly. "No, you taught yourself. I just gave you a moment to see it." They stood there quietly for a few seconds. Two people who once sat on opposite sides of understanding. Now standing side by side. Before parting, she said, "You know, I used to think that story on the plane would always be something I was ashamed of, but now I see it differently. It wasn't the worst moment of my life, it was the beginning of the best one." He nodded. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones that shape us the most. And with that, they walked out into the light of the afternoon, their paths no longer crossing by accident but by purpose. Over the next few years, both of them continued their work, spreading kindness in different corners of the world. Their story became part of a movement, told by people who had never met them, but who lived its message, that humanity at its core is about respect, patience, and the courage to see each other as equals. And though the world still had its flaws, still had moments of judgment and misunderstanding, the echoes of their story lingered. It reminded people that real change doesn't start in governments or headlines. It starts in hearts. One person, one choice, one act of kindness at a time.